Celebrating neurodivergent writing, books and creativity. Welcome to the NeuroLit podcast with your host, Morwenna Stewart.
So, hi, I'm Morwenna Stewart. I'm awesomely autistic and ADHD. I'm also founder and coach at yourwritingpartner.co.uk. Follow us for writing tips on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, YouTube. I think that's it. You're listening to the podcast NeuroLit, where we celebrate neurodivergent writers, artists and creatives. And today we are talking with the lovely David Gray-Hammond. David is an autistic mental health, wellbeing and addiction advocate and consultant. After overcoming addiction and psychosis, he was diagnosed autistic and became part of the autistic community through his love of writing. He runs the Facebook page Emergent Divergence. He's former chief operating officer for the website Neuroclastic. And he's got a fantastic new book out, which is called Unusual Medicine, Essays on Autistic Identity and Drug Addiction. I had to get that right. That's a bit of a mouthful for me to say. But a huge Pride Month celebrating welcome to David. Hooray! Great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
It's fantastic to talk to you. Thank you for your time. So yeah, I mean, you know the sort of format we've had some chats before, David. So, I mean, what I wanted to start with was what brought you to write this amazing book, which I've been dipping in and out of in the last week or so.
Well, the funny thing is most people probably would have expected this to be my first book, but it wasn't. My first book was actually The New Normal, Autistic Musings on the Threat of a Broken Society. So when I first entered the autistic community, I was writing a lot about addiction and neurodivergence and the intersection between the two, because when I came into the autistic community, I was new to recovery from addiction. I was looking around and no one was talking about it. And so I ended up spending a number of years on my website, Emergent Divergence, and a few on Neuroclastic, writing about my experiences of addiction, just because, I thought it was important. There's a lot of misunderstanding when it comes to autistic people and addiction. But sort of towards the beginning of this year, it became evident to me that there needed to be something more than just my blog out there. So I took some essays off of my blog and reworked them and turned them into Unusual Medicine. And, I sort of did this because, much like my first book, it's sort of my love letter to a community that saved my life. If I hadn't discovered the autistic community, I wouldn't have been able to maintain my recovery. And I know there is growing research now showing that there are countless others like me out there in this community. And I want them to feel seen and heard. I want them to read my experiences and go, that happens to me too. And I want them to feel safe about opening up and talking about these experiences. Because when we experience addiction, so often we're encouraged to treat it like a shameful secret. Like we should just keep it to ourselves because society has painted us as a burden. Our families may not have the best view of us because, I'm not going to beat around the bush. When we're experiencing active addiction, we can do things to harm people. But because of that, we're often viewed as the black sheep, the ones who should be ignored or that are untrustworthy. And I want people, especially neurodivergent people who might already be experiencing a lot of stigma, I want people experiencing addiction to know that it's okay to open up, it's okay to reach out for help. And there are countless others out there who have been through what they're going through and they're not alone.
Fantastic. That's such an important message, isn't it? I mean, I'm always interested in people's motivation to write, and that probably brings us kind of nicely onto that. But yeah, I mean, what was it that is it for sort of particular people that you've got in mind that you're writing for, or for yourself, or a bit of both?
So, for the most part, I'm writing for others like me. I also write for myself because, as I always say, I have 1,000 thoughts a minute. And if I don't say them out loud, my head will explode. But also, I wanted professionals who are potentially working with neurodivergent drug addicts. I wanted them to be able to see things from the inside. I wanted them to see that there is a uniqueness to our experience. And like many things, there is no one size fits all approach.
Yeah. Fantastic. So it's for individuals themselves, it's for professionals, it's got a sort of teaching purpose as well.
So I'm hoping that on one hand, it helps people feel like there's someone out there who gets them. But on the other hand, presents insider information to professionals who may be at a loss as to how to support us.
And what do you think is particularly different about the autistic or neurodivergent experience of addiction?
So, I mean, from my own experience, we talk about autistic special interests. Drug and alcohol use became an all consuming special interest of mine. I would read about different drugs, I would research different drugs, I would keep notes on what I'd taken, how much I'd taken, what combinations I'd taken it in, how it affected me. I was
Wow.
treating myself like a living science experiment. And I think often our motivations can be different as well. So drugs can serve as somewhat of a spoons extender. If you're running low on cognitive resources, they don't actually give you more cognitive resources, but they help you ignore the fact that you're burning out.
Yeah.
And so you've got the special interest side, you've got the spoons extending side, but also they do dull down sensory differences if we're struggling with loud noises, bright places that have become necessary for us. um, I think there becomes an increased risk of using drugs or alcohol to take the edge off. Um, it would be important here to also note that I think something like 70% of autistic people are will experience a mental health problem in any given year. And where you have uh, issues of psychiatric distress or psychological distress, um, you're going to see an increased propensity for self-medication with drugs and alcohol. And in fact, this is supported in research. There was a study out of the University of Cambridge by Weir et al. And what they found was, whilst we were less likely to report using recreational drugs, of those who did, we were 9 times more likely than the general population to report self-medicating for behavior management. And we were also increased likelihood to report self-medicating mental health issues. But concerningly, we were also much more likely to report vulnerabilities associated with drug and alcohol use. So what we're talking about there is things like peer pressure, being forced or tricked into taking drugs, being criminally exploited,
Yeah.
experiencing mate crime. So all of these things are quite significant aspects of drug use, that can come into play. And when you take autistic people and put them in that situation, so often we don't teach autistic children how to safely access the community. So it, when you bring drugs into the equation, you've got this terrible mix that can lead to criminal exploitation and all
Yeah.
sorts. And it's a really dangerous situation.
Yeah. And we're more likely to be excluded, and therefore you've got the school to prison pipeline going
Yeah,
on and all sorts of those kinds of things. I mean, there's so much going on in there. It's interesting that it sounds like the reasons for it are very different in our
yeah,
community. It's much more about sort of masking and as a result of trauma and all of those kinds of
mm,
things. Um, that's so interesting. I mean, I'm really interested in the topic, and I'm interested in what made you write as well. But there were a couple of concepts that popped up in the book that I would love to know a little bit more about, and I think people would be interested in. You talk about emotional sobriety and regulation. So, what does that mean to you?
So to me, emotional sobriety is what we achieve later on in recovery. So there's our literal sort of physical sobriety where we've managed to separate ourselves from the drug that we are addicted to. But there's further work that has to be done when we enter recovery. It's not as simple as just stopping. We have to fundamentally change the way we relate to the world, because when we're using drugs and alcohol, part of the appeal is that it's instant relief. So part of emotional sobriety is learning to sit with our feelings and
Yeah.
allow them to come and go without judgment. Because so often, and I think this drives a lot of addiction, we will have a negative feeling, we will judge it harshly, and so we want to get rid of that feeling because we feel that it's a failure or bad to have that feeling. So part of emotional sobriety is to recognize that feelings are neutral. They're not necessarily good or bad. They're just things that happen to us as we go about our lives. But also in emotional sobriety, it's learning to let go of things such as resentment. Now, I'm not asking people to let people walk all over them. What I'm saying
Yeah.
is, as addicts, we can often harbor a great deal of resentment for the things that have brought us to the place we're in our life. And a certain part of emotional sobriety is understanding that we can't change the past. We can hold people to account for what they've done, but we can't spend our lives doing the what if this had never happened, what if that had never happened. We have to come to peace to an extent and learn to coexist with what is inside us.
Wow, some really amazing concepts there, and my mind is just kind of blown with all of them. And I mean, I have a little bit of knowledge of the 12-step programs as well, and I was interested in what you think about those, because I know that they work brilliantly for a lot of people, absolutely love them. But maybe for some populations, they don't work quite so well. What's
So
your feeling?
certainly for me, the 12-step program wasn't a good fit. I did try it for a year, and I maintained my sobriety during that time. But the 12-step program, the way it felt to me, it felt like sort of putting on a pair of trousers that were too small. It it was, I struggled with the fact that, well, we're not religious, but we pray to God, but you have to do these steps in this order. There was a lot of sort of demands, such as making a list of every resentment you've ever held,
Mm.
and like, I did learn from the 12 steps. There were things I took forward with me as I carried on my recovery without them, but for me it wasn't a good fit. And certainly, anecdotally, I've had a lot of people from the autistic community approach me and say, well, actually, I share that experience. It wasn't a good fit for me. And one of the things I really struggled with 12 steps was that the friends I made whilst I was attending were very supportive. But as soon as I backed away from the 12-step program, I found myself cut off and on my own again. So, I think part of the problem is you have, in my opinion, a room full of neurodivergent people who are generally terribly traumatized, and we're not actually, a lot of us are not in a place in our lives where we're ready to be the peer support for another person. But a lot of the people coming to the 12-step program are new to recovery, they're new to living with sobriety. And I think really peer support models work better, in my opinion, when we're a little bit further into recovery. You can have certain peer support that helps with actually achieving that physical sobriety, but then there's a period where perhaps we struggle to engage with others and appreciate other successes, because I think early in sobriety there can be a lot of, well, this person's got so many more years sobriety than me, their life's so much further ahead. And we accidentally create these hierarchies. And if there's one thing I know autistic people don't particularly like,
We
it's
hate that.
hierarchies.
Yeah.
Uh,
That's really interesting. I think I can definitely see some areas that would be really troubling and really difficult for us, and maybe some of the sort of I mean, I'm putting the fault on us, which is not really fair, but our literal thinking. Some people I know find that quite difficult, but I mean, I remember reading a phrase about 12 steps that, what was it? God is for people who are afraid of hell, but faith is for people who've been there, or something like that. And they try to separate out the idea of God and faith, and it obviously works for some people. But yeah, I mean, fascinating stuff. I mean, you work in drug and alcohol services, isn't that right?
I've consulted with drug and
Consulted.
alcohol
Yeah.
services. I've worked with clinical commissioning groups. I've been involved in harm reduction schemes. So, a local university, for example, I helped them attain funding and implement a system whereby student drug users could get testing kits so they could test the purity of their drugs,
Wow.
see if they were what they'd been sold. And I was inspired to do that because I remember in my city, there was a story of two students who died because they believed they were taking cocaine, but what they'd actually been sold was heroin and they overdosed. And that sort of inspired me to get involved in harm reduction, because one thing I've learned through mentoring autistic drug users and working with clinical commissioning groups is that prohibition doesn't stop people from using
No.
drugs. Like, making drugs illegal does not stop their use. If anything, I think they're probably used a bit more because they're more easily available when they're illegal. Like, it sounds
Interesting.
counterintuitive, but actually the prohibition of drugs has created a thriving black market, clandestine market, that it means that anyone really of any age can go to a dealer, get what they want. There's no guarantees on the safety. Like, they don't know if they're getting what they're asking for. They don't know the purity. They don't know what's been mixed in with it.
Yeah.
There's risks associated with getting involved with criminal gangs and criminal exploitation. Um, I'm very much of the opinion that the war on drugs is actually a war on traumatized people, because the only people who really seem to suffer for it are the
Traumatized.
users, and very few of the big people in the clandestine markets who are perpetuating the use of these substances.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I'm kind of with you on the prohibition side. I mean, I wouldn't just open the doors and say everybody do what you want, but
Right.
I don't think prohibition works. I mean, alcohol in America showed us that it doesn't, and there are countries who've been, I think, is it Portugal, who've kind of, and
Decriminalized, yeah.
decriminalized and regulating it and knowing whether things are pure or whatever. It just seems to me to be a complete no-brainer. Um, so what? How much influence do you think the autistic, former addicts and so on, or do you still think of yourself as an addict, or are you former
Yeah,
addict? You
I'm
still,
very
yeah,
much of the opinion that, you never stop being an
yeah,
addict. Once you've become an addict, it's part of your life.
it's you.
So if I don't keep putting the work in daily, there's always that risk I'll go back to it. Because even now, I'm over 7 years sober. There are still days where I
Well
go,
done.
these feelings are difficult. I wish I could just drink them away or take a pill, you
Yeah,
know. And I have to sometimes wrestle with myself to say, I don't want to go back there because I want to live. And actually, drug addiction presented this huge risk to my life and well-being.
yeah. And I mean, do you find it that kind of moving away from the past of what you don't want is stronger, or moving towards the present or the future that you do want is more effective for you? I'm really
So what
curious.
I've found is, in order to keep my sobriety going, with each day, I have to build a life where it is easier and easier to choose sobriety. So on the flip side of that, I have created a life where it's not worth going back to addiction, because my brain will always try and tell me the drugs and alcohol are the answer. But if I've created a life whereby it's easier to not go back to drugs and alcohol, it gives me a really good reason not to. I've got my son in my life who's only 7 months old. There's his sisters, his mother, my sister, and all the work I do for the autistic community. There are so many wonderful things in my life now. I know if I go back to it, I'm potentially throwing all of that away, and that would be really difficult to deal with. But every time I help someone in need, every time I spend time with my family, I realize how much easier my life is now that I'm not having to plan when I'm next getting high.
That's really interesting. It's almost about creating an easy way to make it work for you and other
Yes, but
addicts.
it's
That's
also
interesting.
embracing the fact that even though I'm in recovery, it doesn't mean every single day is joyful.
No,
I have had some horrific days over the last 7 years. In fact, the first month of sobriety, I was locked up on a psychiatric ward because I'm also schizophrenic. I've been through some horrible things. I've had psychotic episodes. I've had health scares. I've had really stressful life events. But it's just realizing how much worse those events would be if I was also using.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I almost use the word in that you use in your book that you don't like, and I completely understand why, of clean there. And that was one of the reasons, I think, where you didn't like or didn't get on with sort of 12-step type life and
Yeah,
language, wasn't it?
yeah.
What's wrong with the word clean?
Well, for me, I know not everyone agrees with me, and perhaps it is because I'm quite a literal thinker. But when we talk about being clean from addiction, that to me seems to imply that there is a dirtiness to being in active addiction. And I believe that's part of the stigma around addiction, is that we're painting people to be dirty humans or less than human. So I believe what we have to embrace is the fact that addiction happens and it doesn't make you any less of a person. They may do things that harm others, they may do things that harm themselves, they may appear to be causing a lot of hassle for people, but they are still human beings with human feelings who deserve love and support, and they deserve not to be viewed as dirty or less than.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting, important distinction to make. That it could be dehumanizing, and words are my first love, and language is really important. What we call ourselves, how we identify, and what came across for me in the book was how your identity had shifted from from who you were to becoming addict to becoming autistic, and how those words and those identities are important. What does that mean to you?
So, this is where I tend to get quite philosophical. I sort of view identity as the masks we switch between. So we have multiple identities. I'm autistic, ADHD, schizophrenic, I'm an addict, I'm a father, I'm a brother, I'm a son. These are all identities, and they're all effectively masks that I wear, because at the core of me is myself, which really, even calling the self a human is another identity. It's all socially constructed. So I'm very much of the opinion that we can use identity to help bring meaning and belonging to our lives, but that we shouldn't be stuck with one identity for the rest of life. So for me, I changed what was expected of me. I queered those expectations. I think I do touch on neuroqueer theory. Definitely in my first book, I'm pretty sure I touched on it in Unusual Medicine. Um, I'm very much of the opinion that we can queer our identities and find something new, something better, something more comfortable. And that for me is really where unmasking comes in, because I don't believe in taking a mask off and suddenly there's an authentic autistic person underneath. I view masking as a projection of acceptability, as written about by Tanya Adkin on my blog, actually. And what I've done is to find an acceptable portrayal of who I am that is comfortable for me. And that's not to say it's always comfortable. There are times when I portray parts of myself that perhaps I'd rather not. But you learn to work with what you are capable of, what you want to be, how you are. And being able to shift identities meant that I did not have to be David the drug addict forever. And yes, I still see being an addict as an identity of mine, but I'm so much more than that now. And in large part, that was thanks to my discovery of the autistic community.
Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you. And I mean, I know a lot of neurotypical people, and I have this battle every day of, why do you need a diagnosis? Why do you want that label? And for a lot of people, and I'm include myself in this, it is about identity and belonging and finding who you are. And what did it bring to you to find out about for yourself?
So I often think of the story of the ugly duckling. The duckling who's surrounded by his brothers and sisters, and they're all these cute little ducklings, and he's not. And one day he just has enough, and he disappears. And it's not until he meets some swans who tell him to look at his own reflection and realize that he's become this very graceful and beautiful swan. And he goes, well, I wasn't an ugly duckling. These other swans have shown me that I'm a swan just like them. And in the same way, diagnosis and finding the autistic community was able to show me that I wasn't a broken neurotypical. There was nothing broken about me. I was an autistic person, and the suffering I was experiencing, I'll admit, when I was first diagnosed, I thought autism was at the core of all of my problems. And I probably would have taken a cure if one had been offered to me. But through
Interesting.
meeting other autistic people and engaging with the community, I realized I wasn't broken and there was nothing that needs fixing. The problem was that because I was autistic, society treated me poorly. And that led to a lot of the trauma that led to my addiction, my schizophrenia. And that's why diagnosis was so important to me, because it set me on a path towards that community. And that's why I will always advocate for this community, because for all its imperfections, it is a place that has saved so many lives.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's it. I mean, it's a life raft. It's a whatever analogy you want to use, and it certainly was for me when I found my people. And I was thinking about it as I was joining today, and thinking about writing and communication. And obviously, some of us have communicate differently in all sorts of different ways. Some of us are non-speaking or minimally verbal, or I hope I'm getting my language right there. I sometimes get it wrong if I'm excited about stuff. But I was curious, because we reach each other through social media and through the written word quite often. I don't know. What do you think is going on there? Why do you think we do that?
I mean, certainly I would start by saying that whilst the pandemic was a terrible thing, it did wonders for the autistic community because we all
Yeah.
started connecting online in a much more meaningful way.
Yeah.
The advent of Zoom meetings and similar has created an autistic community that is so much more robust and supportive than what perhaps we've had in previous years. Because I remember the autistic community before everyone started using things like Zoom, and it was lovely, but there wasn't necessarily much linked up work going on. But because we like to meet online through video chats, because we like to communicate through writing and podcasts and YouTube videos, we've created a community where we can affect meaningful action to start making some really big changes to the world to make it easier for us to live in and for the children who come after us to have an easier time than we did. And that's really the importance, I think, of the way that we communicate. Because so many people would say we're antisocial. In my first book, I said, well, actually, I call it social, AU social, because we have our own sociality. We're not asocial. We we do it differently, but it's valid and it's still just as effective, if not more effective in some cases.
Yeah, we cut to the chase. That's for damn sure. And I always feel that talking to any neurodivergent people, we really we don't do the small talk and so on. And there's obviously something about writing that this kind of idea that we are antisocial is obviously a myth, because otherwise why would we write and reach out and contact people? What do you think is going on there for us?
I mean, I think the fact that we, especially recently, there's been somewhat of a burst of new books by autistic authors, especially, and I think really that demonstrates the fact that we're not antisocial, because when we write a book, we're not just talking to one person. We're potentially talking to the entire world. We are talking to every single person who buys that book. And more so, at least from my perspective, we are laying bare some really deep parts of us for the world to see, And I think that the fact that we do so much writing in the autistic community doesn't just show that we are social creatures with our own form of sociality. It shows the bravery and the willingness to be vulnerable in order to protect those who come after us.
Absolutely, I'd agree. Absolutely agree with that. Contrary to popular myth, the idea that we are sitting alone in our bubbles. But it, tell me a bit more about writing, because I can go off on all sorts of tangents. What do you love about writing? What do you love or hate about writing? The process itself,
I
without
can't
sounding
really
too
think of
pretentious.
much I hate about writing, but what I love about writing is the way I can construct a story and use it to make change. I love the fact that written word can be so powerful, and there are so many things you can do with written word. There seems to be infinite options when it comes to language, and you can use different cultures and different dialects, and you can use different meters in poetry and different writing styles. And it's, for me, it's the single most accessible art form, because contrary to popular belief, there is no wrong or right way of writing. You know, I know lots of people who go, "Oh, I'm too dyslexic to write. I'm too disabled to write." And people wouldn't understand what I'm trying to say because I'm rubbish at writing. And I would say that whatever you can put on the paper is valid,
Yeah,
because
agree.
every word that we type onto the computer, every word that we write onto the paper with a pen is a little piece of ourself, and is art not a reflection of who we are and the experiences and relationship we've had with the world?
Absolutely, and it has its own value. I mean, I always think it doesn't matter if things are kind of bestsellers and sell millions of copies. What matters is that we've said what we need to say and communicated it and reached out and touched other people.
Yeah.
That's what matters to me.
Certainly,
Yeah.
capitalist society has given us all
Yes.
this idea that everything we do has to be profitable. But that's
Exactly.
not what art's for. Art's
Yeah.
not about making money, it's about creating something. And
Yes.
it can be for yourself, it could be for millions of people, it could just be for 10 or 20 people.
Yeah.
Creating something doesn't
Has its
have
own
to
value.
be financially profitable. It is what it is. It's art.
Yeah.
You don't have to be at a stage where you're going to be a Sunday Times bestseller. If you've got something that you want to write, get out there and do it. And don't
Absolutely.
worry about whether other people get it, because someone out there will.
I absolutely agree, and I think even if one person reads it and it has an impact, then it's been worthwhile. But also there's I mean, it's a bit corny kind of thing to say, but I think there is benefit in just doing it to process things for ourselves. I mean, do you find that for yourself, that
Oh,
it's sort
certainly.
of
So I often say I don't know how I feel about something until I've written about it. Writing, I'm ADHD, I'm schizophrenic. Inside my head is chaos. Writing allows me to translate that chaos into something meaningful.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, and that can benefit other people. But it's interesting that it's about processing stuff as well for
Yeah.
people. And I work with a lot of clients, and I think that's the case of putting things into language helps to kind of literally move it around the brain and change it, and kind of grasp it in a different kind of way, which I
Yeah,
think
and
can be really important.
I certainly see my blog, Emergent Divergence, as an extension of my brain. If my literal brain is the raw data, then my blog is the processed data.
That's fantastic. And I was coming back to something you said about emotions earlier and about numbing them with drugs and alcohol, or any other kind of compulsive or addictive substances and behaviours. But come to think of it, but I mean, I was thinking about that, and I lost the train of my thought there, which is so annoying. I do that all the time. So I think it was something about writing, helping with that. Yes, that's right. Emotions are data. So one thing I learned when I was doing coaching training, because I used to think that, as an autistic and now I know ADHD person, I will really struggle with the emotions and processing that with clients. But actually, somebody told me something that I found incredibly useful, which was that emotions are data. And that kind of just chimed with what you said, I think. I don't know if that sparks anything for you.
Yeah, so I very much feel that you know emotions are they're a sensory perception. They are how our body mind responds to environmental stimuli. So, if something is threatening, we will feel fear. If something is affectionate, we may feel love. You know, Emotions are essentially our brain responding to the environment and giving us a feel for how safe we are in that environment. So I very much believe that writing can be an important part of processing those emotions, because many of us who are autistic are also alexithymic,
Yeah.
and it can be difficult to articulate and describe those feelings. So sometimes just getting it out onto a piece of paper can help us move it all around and put it into something that makes sense and is more tangible to us. And this is the thing, writing doesn't have to make sense to other people.
Mm.
One of the most important things is that you create something that tangibly makes sense for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think by virtue of that, it just will connect with other people, because if we
Yeah,
have felt it, then other people will have felt it and thought similar
yeah,
things as well. And for you to articulate that in a way that matters to them will be meaningful. So yeah, that's amazing. What kind of I mean, I'm always curious about how people write, and I don't want to sound like a pretentious person talking about writing, but um, thinking about kind of how you write, and you say that you have quite a sort of chaotic mind. do you have a structure? Do you plan? Do you just write?
So
How do you do it?
much like my brain, my writing process is quite chaotic, but I'm very much into the idea of uh, Deleuze and Guattari's concept of rhizomes. And they have a couple of very lengthy and very wordy books about some of these concepts. And one of them is 1,000 Plateaus. And rather than having chapters, they call them plateaus. And the thing about 1,000 Plateaus is you can they suggest you read the first chapter to begin with, but then the rest of the plateaus you can read in any order, and that's sort of my approach to writing. I don't necessarily have an A to B structure. You can dip in and out to the points that are relevant to you. You know, you can approach it in a way that you want to approach it, and all of the points are interconnected but also independent. You know, they don't rely on each other for their existence. So they all have an intimate relationship whilst maintaining that independence. And it's an independence that allows you to approach it in whatever way works best for the reader. And it also works nicely for me as well, because I very much just like to put words on paper and almost follow the train of thought. Um, and that's really how my writing takes place. Is often I will just get an essay out of my head, and write it down, and then I'll sort of go through at different points and sort of connect different parts and restructure parts. You know, I don't have this sort of like write a plan, follow the plan. Like, it's really just I write with a lot of emotion, I think.
Mm, that definitely comes across, but it's also really compelling because I mean, the way it sounds, it could come across as being a bit chaotic and lacking form or something like that. But when I read what you write, it's very logical, and you may not have started out with a structure in mind, but it does seem to kind of still have a narrative to it. Do you
Yeah.
feel that?
Yeah, so I do tend to have an overarching narrative in my mind when I'm writing, but
Yeah.
I just like to see where ideas can take me. I'm autistic, I'm ADHD, I'm schizophrenic. I like to see where the tangents go.
Yeah, there's value in it. There's
Yeah,
value in it, isn't there?
yeah,
In that kind of chaos. I'm really curious about that because a lot of books I've read by autistic and ADHD writers have quite a structure, chronological or like A to Z or something like that. And it's really interesting reading your book that is essays, and they are, as you say, you kind of couldn't mind map it really, but they do all link up.
yeah.
So it's fascinating to see how different people's. It's almost like a reflection of people's minds, I
Yeah,
think.
well, because the thing with especially like a rhizome is that it doesn't have like a entry point and an exit point, you know, because to do so would create something arborescent, tree-like, that if you cut the trunk off, the rest of the tree dies. When you use like a rhizomatic approach, um, you don't have a beginning or an end. You just have these points that are all interconnected,
Wow,
and you can enter and exit at wherever you please.
love it. I love it, and I certainly did that with your book. I don't know if you intended it, but I dipped in and out. I didn't sort of start at the beginning and go through. I dipped in and out, which was interesting to me, and I don't normally do that. I usually kind of go A to Z. So that's really interesting kind of structure. Um, what's kind of next from you? You've got this amazing book out. What's next in life for you?
So, I mean, I'm writing a chapter for another book at the moment. There'll be more information on that as time goes by. Certainly, I don't think Tanya will mind me saying that Tanya Adkin and I are really thinking hard about writing a book together, especially looking at some of the stuff we've done in the Creating Autistic Suffering series on my blog. For anyone who doesn't know, that series looks at the reasons for negative outcomes in autistic people's lives. We get into things like, local authority, social care failures. We look at trauma. We look at experiences of mental health. We look at different ways that burnout can present. And I think we want to take some of the concepts from that series and develop it into something more long form. Um, but obviously we've got to try and fit that in around the work that we're both doing, which is quite a lot of work. Because
Yep.
aside from my writing, I'm doing mentoring, I'm doing consultations, I'm doing advocacy, I'm doing podcasts, I'm doing live streams. It feels like by the time I do that and it's time to go be a parent again, it doesn't feel like I have a lot of time to stop and think. But I am certain there will be more books in the nearish future.
Oh, good. I'm really pleased to hear that, because I love your writing. So, and I talk to a lot of clients about how you fit it all in, and it is kind of life coaching actually about how the hell you make all that work, because we do want to do everything, don't
Yeah.
we?
Yeah, I won't deny there are times when I overdo it and I find myself teetering on burnout very
We all
often.
do. Yeah.
So I don't necessarily have the healthiest relationship with my work, but I do love my work.
Well, I think that's the case for all of us. I think we're good at kind of dishing out the advice, but not always great at taking it ourselves. I know that's the case anyway. Anything else you want to tell us about that we haven't kind of covered today?
No, I mean, people who are interested, you can visit my blog, emergentdivergence.com. I'm also on Substack at davidsdivergentdiscussions.co.uk. And I have a podcast of the same name called David's Divergent Discussions, which can be found on Spotify, YouTube, on the Substack website. So, I'm everywhere really. You can also find me in a number of live streams for Academy. So I mean, just type my name into Google and lots of things pop up.
Yeah, fantastic. No, I love all the stuff you're doing and all the Academy work, and I know you're doing a live stream tonight as well. So yeah, you do a lot of amazing stuff. Thank you so much for all of that. And as I said, yeah, I'm a bit of a groupie of your work, I have to say, and Neuroclastic, and all do great things. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I shall wrap up. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this podcast. We'll share all the info that David's mentioned on our podcast platforms, website, etc. And do share the podcast with your family, friends, colleagues. And also, if you're interested in writing, you can check out my book on Amazon, which is called 5 Steps to Publish, under my name. Until next time, thank you so much for listening.